Well, good morning. Thanks for the introduction. Like Brian said, my name is Derek Kitchen, and I'm thrilled to be here today. And before I start, if I could just take a moment of personal privilege and appreciate Amy and Brian for the volunteer work that they do to bring Creative Mornings to Salt Lake. I'm constantly more and more enamored with this city, and events like this just contribute to that more and more. To see community building at such an intimate level, I think this is really where great ideas cross-pollinate, and I'm just so excited to be here today. I'm looking at this cool tent, this fort over there, and thinking I need to come back and do something. I'm not sure what, but
you're all welcome in the tent. You'll figure it out.
It's just cool. So, I mean, I just wanted to thank you two for putting this on, and I appreciate your work in the community. So when Brian asked me to come speak on this month's global topic of risk, of course I was honored and excited, but my first thought was, man, what do I have to say about risk? And better yet, what business do I have coming to talk to a group of creatives about risk? I'm not an artist, I'm not an entertainer. I definitely appreciate good design, but I'm not the best critic. I don't self-identify as a creative myself. But the more I put thought into it, the more I realized that risk is in every industry. It's in every profession, and in fact, it's layered in almost every decision that you and I make on a day-to-day basis. And when I think about my life, the events and the decisions that I've made that have made the most impact, or that have, dramatically changed the trajectory of my life, they were all rooted in high-risk decisions. So for example, by the way, that's my dog, Kaya. I needed a placeholder there. So, the first big decision that comes to mind is my business. I was 22 years old, and I just finished college, and I was, under a mountain of student debt, and barely had a stable job, but I quit my job. I sold the only assets that I had, and on a shoestring started a food production business with my partner. And at 22, that was a pretty big risk because I didn't know if I was going to be able to pay rent that next month or buy groceries. I didn't have a way to get around because I sold my car to start this business. So that was a big risk that had a huge impact in my life. Another big decision was the decision to sue the state of Utah. That was, thanks. That decision, it was a natural decision, but it wasn't easy. In fact, as soon as we filed our case, we received, attorneys and legal scholars from Utah and around the country, as far as DC and Los Angeles, all reached out to Moody, my partner, and I, and warned us not to do this. They said, Utah is not the right place. Utah is too conservative, it's too red, it's too religious. This is not the place to have a conversation on marriage equality. And in fact, you risk setting bad case law. And with bad case law, you're going to set our movement back 20, 30 years, who knows. And so there was a lot of risk there, but we decided to move forward anyway, not necessarily in defiance, but because it was the right thing to do, and that's what our gut told us to do. This risk paid off big time, not just for me, but for many people in the community, many friends, many strangers, a lot of people who I didn't even know. And so I'm really grateful to be a part of that, and I'm just proud that that decision paid off. Another big risk decision was running for city council. Launching a campaign for public office, I thought it would be easier than it was, to be honest. A lot of folks asked me during the campaign, how I like it, or what my thoughts are, and time and again, my standard response was always, I've never felt more vulnerable and I've never felt more exposed in my entire life than when I was running for city council. And I think that might have something to do with just being a politician. People are they don't trust you, or they feel like you're a free target, but it definitely helped me grow thicker skin, and so that was a big risk decision for me. And now, looking forward, I'm starting a second business with my partner. This is in the Central 9th neighborhood. This is a conceptual rendering of a restaurant that we're building. It should be complete this summer. And in a lot of ways, this is the biggest risk I've ever taken in my eyes. You might think that because we have experience running an existing business that it might be easy just to do a second business, but this one's a lot different. I've never owned a restaurant before. I've served tables before, but I don't know what it's like to do the day-to-day operations. But that's not the big risk. The big risk is that now we have investors on board, and so there's a financial risk on the table, and that's a little terrifying. I definitely have been losing sleep over that, but it's also very exciting, and I trust myself that it will pay off. And so I think one thing about myself that I wanted to communicate to you all today is that I'm not afraid to take risks. In fact, over the last decade or so, I've made it a practice to take risks on a day-to-day basis. And as I've cultivated this practice of risk-taking, one thing that I've learned from each risk is that it never gets any easier. It's always a little bit uncomfortable and terrifying and scary for sure. But one thing I've learned is that if you surround yourself with support, with people that support your idea or want to encourage you, you can go a lot farther. So in the case for marriage, we had, of course, well-qualified legal representation. We had my family on board. That really matters when you're embarking on a big risk. With my business, I have my business partner. I lean on him. He leans on me. We have staff. We lean on each other. And that really matters in the long run, to find that core base of support when you're making a big risk. Another thing I've learned about risk is that you have to make yourself vulnerable. Vulnerability is inherent to risk, in my opinion. So just to give you a quick example, when I was running for city council, we had a number of political debates. And the first debate that I was engaged in was at the public library, and it was put on by the Central City Community Council. And so they put all the candidates on the stage, and then behind all the candidates was a big screen kind of like this with a live Twitter feed. And I showed up, ready. I had prepared for the previous 3 or 4 days. I was ready to talk about homelessness and economic development and sustainability and all the things that matter to Salt Lake. One thing I wasn't prepared for was criticism. And so my opponent was well prepared and strategic, and he put some of his supporters in the audience and prepped them, and they were ready to go. So when the Twitter feed went live and I started answering questions, then came the criticisms. And so I was inundated with people were calling into question my credibility, my desire for this job, whether or not I was doing it for the right intentions. And I was so embarrassed. It was terrifying. I was pissed off. I was angry, and it sucked. And it was just, it was terrible. But after a day or so, that anger and that hurt feeling subsided. And for me, it was quickly replaced with a sense of defiance, or it sparked in me a competitiveness that I hadn't really experienced before. And that was really great. So it drove me to make sure that my flyers were better looking, that I hired a better graphic designer, and that the content was more specific to Salt Lake City. So I had clear policy proposals. It drove me to make more phone calls to residents. It drove me to knock on more doors, to raise more money. I may not have been the best debater in that situation, but damn it, I was going to be the better candidate. And so, with risk, I think you definitely risk failure, and that's always going to be a possibility. But in failure, you tend to come out on the other side much stronger, much more equipped and aware of yourself to handle the situation that's in front of you. People oftentimes will say that success is directly tied to risk, and I think that there's quite a bit of truth to that. I think a lot of you might say that you have to take risks, and it's part of the creative process. Risk-taking is part of the creative process. I think that's true as well. One thing that I've learned is that in risk, it oftentimes will lead to another risk, another opportunity. Risk leads to opportunity, something that maybe has always been there, but you were blind to it for some reason, or it wasn't there until you took a risk and then it opened up your possibilities. I know for sure that I wouldn't have run for public office if I hadn't been involved in a lawsuit for social justice. It just wasn't even in the realm of possibility for me. And I wouldn't have been involved in that lawsuit for social justice if I hadn't been involved in a business networking organization that connected me to people that brought this idea forward. And so one thing oftentimes leads to another, and I think that's really important to remember. Another thing that I've learned is that not everybody engages in risk at the same level. This is my mom, and she is a wonderful, wonderful woman. I love her so much. But I called her the day before we filed our lawsuit, and I expected complete support, which I did get in the end. But her first response was to break down in tears. She was terrified. Her instinct was to feel fear on my behalf. She was afraid of my emotional well-being. She was fearful for my physical safety, and that's what any good mother would respond like. And that's okay. Not everybody has the same level of risk tolerance, and I think that's a great thing. So even though we can't all engage in risk at the same level, we can all be better at stepping out of our comfort zone. We can all be better at embarking into the unknown, and we can all be better at trusting ourselves more. And for me, that's the foundation of this lifestyle of risk-taking that I've cultivated, is trusting myself. I know that no matter what happens, I'm smart enough to figure it out. Even if the plan doesn't go according to plan, or even if the event doesn't go according to plan, I trust myself. I know that I'm nimble and flexible enough to handle the situation as it unfolds. And so trusting yourself really becomes the root foundation for risk-taking. So with that, I would just want to say we have a couple of takeaways that I want to really drive home. Take risks, but be strategic about it. You want to couch your risk in your broader personal goals. You want to make sure that not only do you have the support to get you to where you want to go, but that you're being strategic, because you can definitely be successful taking a risk on a whim, but it's much better if you have support and a good game plan in place. Be vulnerable. Vulnerability is hard. It's not easy. But we have to be vulnerable if we're going to impact the world. If we're going to make a real change in our community, we have to raise our voices. We have to make our voices heard. In the creative world, be vulnerable with your creations. Be vulnerable with your ideas. Bring your collaborations forward and let them see the light of day. Risk being vulnerable and risk criticism, because it's definitely worth it. So, be bold, be brave, and be risky. And with that, I have just a question that I want each and every one of you to consider right now to yourself, and every day if you can. I want you to ask yourself, how can I engage in risk with more pleasure and less effort? So, in other words, take risks, but do so with less anxiety and more confidence in yourself. Thank you.